Welcome to the Wish I'd Known Then podcast, where we focus on how authors found success, looking at strategies that have taken them to the top of the bestseller charts, as well as what they've learned from their mistakes. Because being an indie author is more than knowing the latest marketing trend. It's about being innovative and creative and learning from your mistakes.
Welcome to the Wish I'd Known Then podcast. I'm Sara, Rosett.
And I'm Jamie Albright. And this week on the show we have
Jo Lallo.
Yes, we do. It's awesome.
Yes, we talk about so many different things in this, but the theme that I think that came out in almost everything we talked about was planning, and about how he had learned to plan and outlining in his marketing. Even talked about Nano, how he had to learn to plan for that and how that's changed over the years.
Well, and how he planned when he left his day job.
Yes, yeah. And so it's really good. And we talk about all of that, and then his tips for writing short stories, because he does that a lot. And then he commissions a lot of art, tips on how to do that, and about leaving your day job. So so lots of good stuff covered in this podcast.
Yeah. Well, what's going on with you?
This week has been kind of busy. I do have a couple of things I was going to mention. I actually got back to writing this week. Not a lot of words, but I did get some words down. So new book is started. So that's good.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I had a interview I did with Alessandra Torre and Tonya Kappes about cozy mysteries and reader expectations. And that was a Facebook Live. So I'll link to that. Because so it was really fun, and we talked about what readers want, and we showed our cover, different cover types that are typical of cozies, and that was a lot of fun. So I'll link to that. And because it's the first week of November, if anyone is interested in doing, I have a short, tiny mini course on how to start writing a cozy mystery. So I'll link to that as well.
Yeah.
So because it's Nano, and everybody's all excited. First day of November. What's that?
Do you do Nano?
I have never done Nano myself.
Me either. And that's NaNoWriMo for anyone who doesn't understand. You basically write a book, but it's not necessarily, it's a 50,000 word first draft for a lot of people.
Yeah.
You start on the 1st of November and you end on the last day of the month. And a lot of people have gotten their start writing their books.
Yeah, I think it's a great organization, and you can get lots of organization support from other writers. You can connect with other writers really easily. So if you're looking for a group of writers to write with, this would be a good way to find some people.
Yeah.
So it kind of came in after I had started writing, and I already had my system down. So I haven't really. Yeah. And to me, November is always just a crazy month. But I did hear a podcast with the guy who started, and he started NaNoWriMo, and he said that if you can write a book in November, you can write a book in any month. And I thought that is the truth. That is the truth.
That is the truth. Well, I too have gotten words on the page, and actually, the book that I'm sending out a chapter at a time in my newsletter, I wrote a new chapter, edited it, and got it out this week. Got some other words down, and so that's a good feeling, because for a while I had written, and it's kind of scary when you sit down to write again after not writing for a while. So I'm not doing Nano, but I am kind of looking at November and thinking, how can I get the most out of November? So I'll let y'all know how that goes, but. Yeah, that's about it. It's just been kind of a crazy week around here, and, as per normal. And, but things are good. Yeah. So we should probably get on to the interview. Yes. Really awesome.
Yeah, sounds good. So here's Jo Lallo. Today we're really excited to have Jo Lallo with us. Hi, Jo.
Hello.
Hi, Jo.
Hi.
All right, let me read your bio, and then we'll get started with the questions. Joseph Lallo was educated at NJIT, where he earned a master's degree in computer engineering. In September of 2014, he was given the opportunity to take a promotion that would eliminate his writing time or become a full-time author. he chose the books. Since then, he has written dozens of novels and novellas in genres across the science fiction and fantasy spectrum. Highlights include the international best-selling Book of Deacon series and the critically acclaimed Free Range series. In addition to writing, he helps run the Six Figure Authors podcast with Lindsay Broker and Andrea Pearson. Past ventures have included the science fiction and fantasy marketing podcast and BrainLazy.com. In his spare time, he builds pointless doodads in his ridiculously over-equipped basement workshop.
That's right.
So welcome.
Hello.
So tell us, how did you get into writing?
I've been writing for a long time. When I was a little kid, I was writing stories. I remember in kindergarten we had to write a story about the day, and I didn't know how to write, so I had to tell the teacher what story I wanted. And I used the phrase, the sun caught sight of a cloud. And she was like, I'm going to write the sun saw the cloud. And I was like, that's not what I said. So,
Stop editing me.
Yeah, I had a relationship with editors early on. But my actual writing, if you start the thread that continues to today, in second grade, I was playing little improvised games, I guess what you would call I don't know, LARPing now, except I didn't have a costume. So, but it was based on a video game called Dragon Warrior, which is now called Dragon Quest. And a bunch of my friends would just sort of make up stories that was in that setting, and they grew out of it. And I wrote down what I was coming up with, and those characters mutated. And then eventually I got into college and I learned to type, and I typed 11 spiral-bound notebooks of stuff into the computer, and then I edited those into 3 books, and that was the Book of Deacon trilogy, which is what got me started in the actual career.
Wow, that is amazing. That is great. Well, so what was your Book of Deacon, your first big success? Would you consider that your first big success?
It was definitely my first big success, although it didn't start off as a success. Because, again, I wrote the first 3 books at the same time. I put the first one up with a terrible cover, a terrible homemade cover, and no editing. And I priced it at $10, which that's what the traditional people were doing. So I did that. I sold 1 copy, and then I sold 2 more the next year after I dropped the price twice. But I had already written 3, so I just I'll put the other 2 out. They're already done. And then I made the first one free, and that was what did it.
Yeah.
That was about in 2011. I made the first one free, and I got the idea from Brian S. Pratt, who had done the same thing. And when it went free, it made 25,000 downloads, because there was a website back then called Pixel of Ink, which would just basically report new free books. And by the end of the first big sales thing, because I had a book following it up, I'd made $3,000 in sales. So I used the $3,000 to get new covers, and then eventually to get new edits, and things started to grow from there.
Yeah, but the story itself must have been compelling. I mean, I think a lot of it is the story. If you can get readers into the story, then later on you can fix, it's better if you can do your cover and editing before, but
yeah. And I also because it was written all as one big chunk, I made a decision I probably wouldn't make today, which was that the first one ended in a ridiculous cliffhanger. The main character is in a cave that is flooding, and then that's the end of the book.
Oh my gosh.
So you get a free book that's 150,000 words, and it ends with someone in a dire situation. It was mean, but it probably helped out a little bit.
Yeah. Readers don't like cliffhangers, but I think they do help with read-through.
They do
get read-through going.
They do. What do you wish you'd known about writing and craft?
I wish I'd known how to properly outline at the begining. Like I said, there was 11 spiral-bound notebooks, which is a lot. And I chopped a bunch out of that. But the first quote-unquote book, which I split into 3, was still almost 500,000 words. And it took me from, second grade until college to write it. So if I'd known back in the beginning how pantsing just makes a book get longer, I would have outlined better. My pacing is always better when I outline. The books are shorter and nicer when I outline, and they get written more quickly. So if I had learned to outline up front, I probably would have twice as many books by now.
How did you learn to outline? I mean, did you use a specific tool or method?
Not really. Basically, because originally writing was just a hobby, and I would just sit down in class, and instead of doing what class wanted me to do, I would write stories. It wasn't until I basically did my 3rd NaNoWriMo, and I realized that I was going to have to really I had a bigger idea than was really appropriate for NaNoWriMo. So instead of sitting there and deciding, I usually started with, okay, this is the setting, these are the characters, and I want to end this way. And then I would pants from there. I was like, I need to have a couple of dots to connect. And so I just started like writing down. Eventually got to the point where, well, heck, if I just write a little thumbnail for every chapter, then every time I'm starting a chapter, I know where I'm going to go.
Right.
I didn't actually read any books on outlining until much, much later.
Oh, but that's a great idea. That's something I could incorporate at any point. So, yeah, that's great.
You're still very much into NaNoWriMo, right?
Yeah, I'm prepping for this year.
Yeah.
I've written the outline, in fact.
I was going to say, has your prep changed in any way? Or
like I said, the first three, I just sat down with an idea, and I had already had the idea, but I literally didn't put word to page or even name the characters until the start. And then once I started like writing, I have a series called it's a steampunk series called Free Wrench, and the first book in that was written during NaNoWriMo, and it did well enough that I wrote the second book in the following NaNoWriMo. And because that meant that I had to continue a plot, and I had pre-existing characters and continuity, I knew that I couldn't just sit down. Like it would require too much referring back to the previous book if I wasn't prepared. So since I started doing books that are in pre-existing series during NaNoWriMo, I've had to really get my act together and make sure that I had a layout. Although I always go over in length. I say that my outlines keep my books shorter, but they don't keep them short enough.
Yeah, that happens.
Your steampunk books, how long are they usually?
I mean, again, because the first three were written during NaNoWriMo, so they were in the neighborhood of 50,000 words. But I think the first one was 65,000, and the second one was 75,000, and the third one was 90,000. So like it keeps on getting bigger as I get more continuity.
That's true. Well, what about marketing? What do you wish you had known about marketing?
I wish I had known that I was going to have to market. At the beginning, it was super easy. Because there wasn't really wasn't a lot of people doing free series starters, for example, so it just sort of took care of itself. And then I had another couple of good launches, so I just thought, it's always going to be this easy. But really, I think the main thing I wish I had known, especially for that first hit, was I wish I had known about mailing lists. Like it didn't strike me as a thing that I needed. Again, this is 2011. There weren't a lot of like resources for how to be an author. Yeah. So I had no mailing list, and obviously didn't have a sign up for that mailing list. I got 25,000 hits over the course of a month, and none of them had any way to know about me afterward. I think I don't even know if I had a website at that time.
Yeah.
So it was just I would probably have triple the mailing list I have now if I had been ready to like receive it back then. But so I missed out on that first big bump, and it was tricky. And and like I say, I wished I'd known that the gravy train wasn't going to continue. The tricky thing when you're getting started, and again, when there weren't any resources, is you think, what I'm doing is the correct thing to do, and it's working because I'm doing the correct things. And I was for a lot of stuff. I was, my covers were pretty darn spot on, and I was clearly, putting together books that people found interesting. But as I continued to diversify and increase the number of places my books were available, and I had audiobooks and translations and all that stuff, my income was staying pretty steady because of all that. And it should have been increasing because of all of that. Wow. So like now I know that like, high quality advertising policy and just sort of having something in place that's both to maintenance to your backlist and also to push your promos. I can usually do a pretty decent launch if I plan for it. I didn't plan for this most recent one. But I just wish I'd gotten better at maintenance advertising and known to sort of have those chops sharpened up for when things started to get more competitive.
So what do you do for your maintenance advertising?
Not a whole lot. I have in the past had some pretty successful Amazon ads, and when I do a launch, I usually have some Facebook pushes, but that's really about it. Early on, the only thing I would do in terms of advertising was I was particularly lucky at getting book pubs. I must have gotten 7 book pubs in the first few years. Wow. So now I always have at least 2 or 3 ads running on Amazon, and I will do periodic pushes on book pub, like the BookBug pay-per-click ads. But generally speaking, I am woefully under-equipped when it comes to just ongoing advertising.
Yeah.
It's harder. I mean, I just found that it's with more books, it's harder to advertise. I mean, it should be easier, but there's just so much to keep up with, and you have to advertise your backlist different than you advertise your new book. And if your new book doesn't really lead to anywhere, then you really have to stick with your backlist. And It's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah.
So what assumption did you make at the beginning of your writing career? Looking back, did those assumptions turn out to be right or wrong?
Well, my first assumption, and the one that almost is responsible for me publishing, is that I assumed no one would read my stuff. I genuinely thought, like, it's okay if it's not that good, because it's not like anyone's going to read it. So that one was wrong. I also thought that traditional publishing was the only way to go. You'll note that I had said that I had finished writing in college, and I graduated from college in 2005 and 2007 because I got a master's degree. But I didn't start my publishing career until the beginning of 2010, and that 3 to 5 year gap was me trying to get an agent. And I would, write 2 query letters and send them out and wait a month to be either rejected or ignored, and then do it again. And I wasted years and years. I feel like I would have done a whole lot better if I had been going. I mean, obviously, Kindle didn't come out until the year before I started. And it didn't really explode until the year after I started. So I wouldn't have had an easy time of it, but I would have had a better foundation by the time it came around. I was also a terrible judge of my own capacity. I'm not a virtuoso, but you don't need to be. I just didn't think that I was going to have what it took after being rejected, a couple dozen times. So I just had a really badly calibrated view of my career in general at that time.
Yeah, I think when you try, because I did that too. I tried and got rejected a lot. I did eventually get an agent and get a contract, but it does give you a whole different perspective. And what I learned with indie and going indie is that New York and agents and editors often do not really understand what readers want. And, you may be rejected because you don't fit in their mold, but that doesn't mean that there aren't readers out there who like your stuff, and it doesn't mean that you're not a good writer. You may just be that they've already bought a book just exactly like yours, so they're not interested. So,
yeah, that's definitely information I wish I had sort of had in my head. Although I wouldn't have believed it, because I'm much more willing to believe that I've done something wrong than I've done something right.
Yeah. Well, here's one of our questions we like to ask. Have you ever made a mistake that turned out to be a good thing?
A free wrench was a mistake. That my steampunk series turned out to be a good thing. I recommend people when they want to know how to write a successful book, I tell them to learn the tropes of the genre. Like, either you look like. We frequently recommend that you find a genre that you enjoy that's also selling well, and that's that's writing to market. But alternately, you can just whatever you feel like writing, just learn what people are expecting and make sure you're going to give it to them. And I thought I did that with Free Wrench because Free Wrench is steampunk, and steampunk is mostly an aesthetic. So it's like, well, it's got airships, it's got goggles, it's got corsets, it's got steam. That's steampunk. It turns out steampunk is way more rigidly defined than that. And the very fact that my steampunk takes place in a secondary world instead of in Victorian England, which is where almost all of them take place, is enough for a lot of people to just say it's not steampunk. I haven't received emails telling me it's not steampunk because it's a reasonably good story and it had a compelling cover and all that. A lot of people came in to read this is their first steampunk, so I'm sort of misrepresenting the entire genre to a whole group of people. But it worked really well. It was I say it's critically acclaimed. This was a book of the month on iBooks when it released in Amazon in New Zealand, but it still counts. So it's turned out to be probably my second best-selling series, like if you take them as a whole. So I did not do it correctly, but it still worked out pretty well for me.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, a lot of times we think we know things, and then we realize how much we didn't know and didn't understand.
Right. So much. So vice versa. So have you ever thought, this is just the best thing I've ever done. This is going to be it. This is a home run, and then it turned out to not work out so well?
The most recent book series, my most recent new book series was urban fantasy, and I thought, I did the work. I thought it was going to be a hit. I did a bunch of good ideas the past few years, absorbing from peers and stuff. I understood what it took to do a launch in a way that I didn't before. In my previous launches, so I did all the things I thought were the correct thing to do. I picked a series that I thought was really effective, and I sort of absorbed the tropes from that and included them in it. I launched into KDP. I did a rapid release with 3 books. I set up an ad campaign at the very beginning, and the series fell on its face. And it fell on its face for a number of reasons. Number one, it turns out the series that I chose, I actually talked about this in the podcast I just recorded. The series I chose for urban fantasy was the Dresden Files, which is a very successful urban fantasy series, but it's not representative of the genre. It's basically a subgenre in and of itself. And so people who were not looking for the urban fantasy that I wrote. And I also, because I had done wide previously, a huge number of more than half of my audience is probably wide. And I wasn't launching into that market. So I was trying to make sure they could at least get their hands in the book. I didn't want to abandon my old audience, which meant that I did a launch in Story Bundle. I debuted in Story Bundle, and I got a couple of hundred. For people who aren't familiar, Story Bundle is basically a pay what you want limited time bundle service. So I debuted in that, and I got a couple of hundred sales in that were therefore not day one sales on Amazon. Like, I'm sure many of those people would have bought it on Amazon. They just wanted it early, and so I stole a bunch of launch sales from myself. And in general, I thought I did everything right. I put together a story I thought was great, and it has been, by a huge margin, the least successful launch I've had in a long time. So it happens.
Yeah, it does. It happens. So the Dresden Files, because it's got a male protagonist. I mean, so in most urban fantasies have a female. Is that one of the things that you found?
That's one of the things. Most urban fantasies tend to have a focus on really well-established creatures, like paranormal creatures. So you'll usually have vampires or werewolves in an urban fantasy, and mine is these shadow creatures, which are things I made up, or most like what I made up. They're certainly not. No one's out there searching for these creatures. Yeah. And also even within the little subgenre I put together, Harry Dresden is basically a private eye. And I made a guy who's a photographer, and he gets involved in doing an investigation. Like, he's basically doing the work of a private eye, but he isn't one. So I said, just right next to the trope. Like, it's a habit of mine that I have to solve.
So it's sort of a cozy.
I would say it does sound very much like maybe a cozier,
a cozy
amateur sleuth almost mystery. Yeah.
I'm sure, and that's another thing that I'm looking perhaps to do, because I plotted it for 5 books, and it's only 3 because after the first one didn't do so well, and therefore limited the capacity for the second and third one to do well. And I had spent 6 months putting it together. I was like, I don't like this series anymore. I'm going to do something else. So I still have to write 2 more, and I might do a rebrand and a relaunch. Because then once you have a 4th and 5th book out, you can make a bundle of the first 3. There's ways forward with the series, but boy, oh boy, I thought it was a great idea, and it was not.
Thanks for sharing that, though, because I feel like there's a lot of people that it's comforting to hear that, sometimes you do check all the boxes and you do everything right, and it just doesn't work. And it may be just the market. It may be the right, like the way it's positioned, but a lot of times we don't hear about the things that didn't go so well. So
I'm more than willing to talk about the ridiculous, silly things I do.
Well, I like your attitude that, you're going to try different things with that series. I mean, you're not just going to give up on it because you've written it, and it's still yours. At some point, there may be just people clamoring for shadow creatures. I mean, you don't know.
Some movie will come out and I'll be like, hey.
Exactly.
Look at that.
Read my book
I've got
next.
shadow pictures right here. Yeah,
that's right. Well, you write a lot of short stories. So can you tell us about how you think about short stories and plan them differently from your book?
I do. Again, on a recent podcast, I mentioned very briefly, but I don't like to throw anything away. When I'm editing a book and I cut something out, I don't delete it. I move it over into a folder. Or when I have an idea that won't fit into a book, I write that down and I put it in a folder. I call it the bad idea exercise, or the bad idea file. And the short stories are basically like orphaned ideas. Usually they're like orphaned ideas that the nice thing about a short story is that it can be basically all premise. Like, the plot of a short story can be super different. It just needs to be interesting for 5,000 words or 9,000 words. So I'll take just a cool idea that just has to be interesting for the course of that idea, and just blow it out. And, you start in the middle, which is nice. And so you don't, you can throw away a ton of setup and let people figure out. It usually ends up being more of a mystery, just because there's not a lot of context. But yeah, my process is usually I take a little nugget, and instead of giving it a point A, point B, point C, and a full plot, I'll just sort of have one really interesting event. Occasionally what I'll do is I'll ask the fans, like, what character you want to learn more about. And so a lot of the short stories end up being like origin stories for characters. But in general, instead of coming up with a plot that I really like, it's coming up with a premise I really like, or coming up with a character I really like, and just sort of having a study of that character for 10 pages.
Okay, that's interesting, because I always feel like a short story, when I've tried to do it in the past, I haven't done many because it seems to take me almost as long to write a short story as like the first third of the novel. But I try and encapsulate, the arc that you would get maybe in a novel into a short story, and that's just almost impossible in many ways. So,
yeah, it'll have a very rushed plot, pace that is, and it'll feel like very crowded. But I usually try to like leave off the first act entirely and start with the second act, and then end it off when you realize what the third act will be. Almost like that's about half of my stories end up being just basically a big act 2.
That is interesting.
That is. So what do you do with these short stories? I mean, do you sell them? Do you give them away? Do you use them on Patreon?
I always use them on Patreon. There's a few ways that I've used them. Like, I have a Patreon where if you support me for at least $1, you get all the short stories I write. I release at least one a month. My coffers are currently empty, so they'll be getting a question mark in a couple of days. But so far I have over a year I haven't missed. And then when it comes to giving away or selling them, if it grows out of control, which has happened 3 times, 3 of the short stories have ended up being 40,000 words, and that's not a short story, it's a novella. So I get a cover for it, and I get the edit, and I put it up for sale. Those are never big seller and big earners. Again, I tend to write long, and my audience expects it. So if I give them a 40,000 word thing, they're usually not clamoring for it.
Yeah.
But I've already written it, and I've technically already made my money off of it because it's in the Patreon. So it's just a little extra thing. And then what I did was, after the first year, I had said right up front I didn't want to lock things away in the Patreon forever. I don't really like paywalls. So I was like, you'll all eventually get a chance to read this stuff. So after the first year, I took all of the stories that were not in a pre-existing series, and I made an anthology called Paradoxes and Dragons. And I made that available for sale, and that was about 90,000 words, I think. And then I took all the ones that were available in that were part of a pre-existing series, and I called that Side Quests. And I made that a newsletter bundle where, like, if you sign up, you can get side quests. So everything is getting used 2 or 3 times at this point.
Oh, that's great, though. Oh, that's
really
so smart.
Yeah. Every time I hear people talking, like you talking about short stories and things like that, I think, I need to write more of these, because they do have a lot of possibilities, and I just feel like they take so much time for me mentally. So I need to figure that out, I guess.
Yeah, it helps when you have, again, a file full of, how about this? Like, good idea. Me from 4 years ago. I'll do that.
Yeah, that's very cool.
That's great. Yeah.
Well, you also commission a lot of art for your related to your books. So can you talk to us about that if someone's interested in doing that? Do you have any tips for them, or any pitfalls to avoid?
Sure. Pitfalls to avoid, I'll start with. I'm trying to be more diplomatic about this one. The phrase that I've used in the past was, not all artists are flaky, but it's easy to find a flaky artist. Artists are in incredibly high demand, and generally speaking, when they're taking individual commissions from someone, it's in addition to a pre-existing workload. So, vet your artist for their capacity to complete your project. I have so far been extremely lucky. I think there's only 3 projects since I've started doing this that have not, given me something. But occasionally you'll run into an artist who, for either because they just get overworked and your stuff is lower priority, or because they realize to their dismay that they just can't complete the project. Usually they'll let you know and they'll refund the money, but occasionally they just sort of vanish from the internet. So do a little bit of work, make sure that this artist has been reasonably reliable, and that's not hard to do. Usually their portfolio will be filled with things that are marked as commissions, and if you you can go and see how those people, what their experience was.
Yeah.
But in terms of like, how do I use them and how do you get them? I have started off, I just searched my cover artist. It was from DeviantArt. I just went on DeviantArt and I typed in epic fantasy and I found something I liked. And then I hired him and it's worked out very well for both of us. But once you start working with artists frequently, you start to get a network of artists. Like they start recommending, oh, well, I'm not that good with this, but this person is. So one piece of advice I give is only ask an artist for something that they're comfortable doing, because number one, it'll come out faster. Number two, it will come out better. And number three, if you are asking them to do something they can't do, they're going to know someone who can. So it's just easier overall to pick something in the wheelhouse of your artist. And for usage of it, I mean, I use art right now, if this was a video podcast, you'd see a background, and that background was art that I commissioned for covers. I was going to do a sci-fi serial, and I didn't want to have to pay for 7 covers. So what I bought was 3 backgrounds, 3 foreground objects, and 3 characters, and I was just going to composite new covers out of them. And so that cost about as much as one cover, but I could mix and match into however many covers that I chose. So like the short stories, if you want, I'm doing it mostly because I like art, but if you want the art to be useful to you, then have a plan for the way that you can use it. And there's 1,000 ways you can use art. Yes, covers, obviously. But if you're active on social media, particularly on Facebook likes posts with art in it. But you posting an image people are going to click on it more often and respond to it more often. So I had a bunch of podcast headers made that feature my characters. And it's like, if I have a question, well, here's the one I use for when I have a question. If I have a sale, here's the one I use for when I have a sale. So just having art like that is good. And also, it always gives you something to talk about. You can throw it into if you have nothing else to talk about during it's time to send out a newsletter and you've got nothing else to talk about. Well, here's some character art, and how do you picture this character? So artwork, aside from just being a thing that I like and I would have been commissioning anyway because I want it to exist, it's always there as like garnish for stuff that you're going to be doing anyway. However, I will say, when it comes to things like advertising, make sure you're allowed to. This is a pitfall that people will fall into also, is your art, your rights to the art that you commission are occasionally limited. And one of the major limitations is editing. And that includes adding text to something. And another limitation might be putting it on merchandise. That's almost always not included in the rights that you get when you commission something. So make sure that you find out if you're allowed to. Advertising, another one. Technically, that's using your thing as a product. Although if you're getting it as a cover, you are allowed to advertise, because your cover is considered to be a promotional material, and so is advertising. So just talk to your artist and let them know. Usually you don't need a contract. Usually you're working with prices that aren't going to require a contract, but have an email thread that maintains what you're allowed to do.
Yeah.
Right. I just I bought custom images for my last cover. It's the first time I've done that. And then I thought, I can put the book cover on a t-shirt, but I didn't want to sell them because I don't have merch. But I did go to the photographer and cleared it with them. And I went to my cover artist and cleared it with her. And, both of them were like, first of all, thanks for coming to us. And second of all, if it's for less than, 10 or less things, sure, you can use it. But if you're going to start mass producing things, then we have an issue. But so, you just need to talk to them and ask, what is and isn't okay. Because they still sort of own that, we bought it. Yeah.
You have to pay it. You have to pay an enormous amount of money to get like full rights. And the reason they don't want to sell you full rights is because when you have full rights, it doesn't belong to them anymore. It can't even be in their portfolio half the time.
Correct.
So they're not going to give you full rights unless you explicitly ask for them. And then there's always an extra fee, unless they're very new. If they're not a professional artist, sometimes you can effectively take advantage of them, which is a terrible thing to do. Don't do that.
Horrible. We do not recommend that.
I would not recommend taking advantage of artists. Yeah. You'll hurt. Like, even if you thought it was a great idea, you'll soon find you can't get artists to work with you because they talk to each other.
Yeah.
Like, if you're being an awful community person, they're not going to work with you anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. I commissioned some maps for one of my books. Because my covers tend to be not commissioned art, but I did some maps, and same thing. I could use them, for promotion and in the books. But if I want to use them for anything else, she still owns the rights, which makes total sense. And I was going to say how smart to get several different, like the foreground, background, and what was the other thing that you had commissioned? The character. And then you could kind of mix and match so that you wouldn't have the same, you could have some variety in your covers, but also unity. I've never heard of that. I think that's very, very smart to do.
I also got them in grayscale so that I could do color tints, which is more for the background than for the character. You're not going to have like a purple person unless they're purple. But
right, exactly. Well, and I just heard on y'all's podcast yesterday, Andrea was talking about she found some place where she got covers and she was able to get kind of the individual elements so that she could do all those things and stuff. And it was a pre-made cover, correct?
Yeah, pre-made covers are almost always, I think they call it composited, where it's individual, like basically clip art, not clip art, but stock photos that have been modified and put together. And generally speaking, the artist is going to have available to them, and almost never available to you unless you ask for it, a layered file that has all those individual elements separated. So again, if you want one, ask for it, and it might cost extra. Sometimes it doesn't. Like my cover artist, I never ask for the layered version, but my cover artist, when asked for, will always give me the layered version.
Yeah. Mine too, and I have asked, and so that's another thing because I don't use pre-made covers. I use covers. I have a cover artist, but you have to ask for those layered composites because they don't generally give them to you, but you can, and then you can use those in different ways. So that's really cool.
They're particularly useful if you're if you did not initially ask for an audiobook cover, because audiobook covers are a different shape than regular covers. And if you get the layered version, then you can move the text because the text
is very important.
Yeah, it is. So in your bio, you describe how you moved from the corporate world to full-time writing. What do you wish you'd known about that transition, and any advice for someone considering the move?
My first thing I would say, give yourself a huge buffer. I am able to continue being an author right now. I'm in the midst of, largely because of that failed enterprise with the new series. I'm not earning nearly what I was 4 years ago, but I'm able to keep doing this because I stayed at my job. I was making basically I was making a full-time income from my job, obviously. And then for about a year and a half, I was making the money that I was making from my job was enough to pay the taxes on the money I was making from my books. Like I had a much more successful book career, but I stayed working for a couple of years so that I could bank as much of it as possible. And I would definitely recommend that. You will be, if you start seeing really good sales, you will be tempted to jump in and try to make the most of that immediately. And that can definitely work for you. But I have yourself in a situation where you have put together for the inevitable doldrums, and just, even if, I paid off student loans, I made sure I had zero debt, and I got the down payment on a house, and I started a retirement thing. Get yourself ready so that when the time comes, you can weather things much more easily when your income goes down, because your costs go down because you don't have debt anymore. So just be prepared is one piece of recommendation I would have. And in my case, like I say in the thing, I was offered the opportunity to get a raise, and the raise would have given me $25,000 a year more and doubled my workload, and I wouldn't have been able to write anymore. And if that hadn't come along, there's a very good chance I would still be writing and working. It's a hard road when you become a full-time author. It's very uncertain. And you need to be aware of that, and you need to know if that's the sort of thing you can handle. Because I wouldn't have thought I could handle it. I apparently can, because I quit, many years ago. But yeah, I would definitely say do your research. If you're listening to a podcast like this, then you're doing your research. But be certain that when you step out onto that shaky raft, that you're going to be able to get through some rapids when the time comes. And other than that, just if you're going to quit your job and go full time, have something. This is something I wish I had done, and it didn't really make a difference. But have a thing that is like your big debut when you quit your job and go full time. It feels scummy, but everything that you do as an author is a potential to help you promote. So, you know, big celebration. Hey, I quit my job. And to celebrate, here's this book. You know what I mean? It's a major event in your life, and it feels big to you, and you can make it feel big to your audience. So if like I had sort of started a new series at that same time, I was already starting a new chapter in my life. Here's a new chapter in my career. Just sort of treat it like it was a business decision, because it is a business decision.
Yeah, launch yourself sort of as you, And I know that there would be people who would be like, oh, I want to support this person because I enjoy their book. So I'm definitely buying this new book because they're transitioning into this new phase. I think that's really smart. Good advice.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people, that going full time is the holy grail. I mean, we all think that's the goal. And sometimes it's not as great as we thought it would be. I mean, for me, it's great, but there are days that I wish that I was still around people and working because I need that interaction. But I think if you look at your job the way you did, where it's sort of a means to an end, you're using that full-time job to get you to a place where you could go full-time. It changes your attitude about the job, because it's easy to get this, I hate my job, I want to write full-time attitude. But if you can switch the perspective and say, this job is allowing me to get to a point where I can write full-time, it just makes life better. It makes you a lot less, unhappy, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, there's a phrase I heard on Dirty Jobs. It's not from Dirty Jobs, but when your avocation becomes your vocation, you get no vacation. So I mean, like if you do what you love, they say you're not going to work a day in your life. You're never going to stop working, because when you're finished doing your job, you continue doing your job because it's also your hobby.
And even if you're trying to sleep, you're still thinking about your hobby / job that you do.
Exactly.
I tell people being an author is like assigning yourself homework for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And, you really kind of have to like homework, which I didn't always. So you have to work on that attitude a lot of the time. Or I do. Anyway, I'm sure a lot of people don't, but I do. So.
Well, what's the best thing you've done to set yourself up for success in your author career?
Getting organized was a super important thing. You need to have a plan. Early on, I was just like, what do I want to write next? And then I wrote that. And you really ought to know, here's a couple of things you can do. Just take a look at the date you're supposed to release a book and see if that's a good idea. Because I have my release schedule prior to being more intelligent was I would write a book, and when I was done, I'd put it up for pre-order, and I would pre-order for an arbitrarily long amount of time and then release on a day that I thought made sense. And once that day was April Fool's Day, and it was a book that was very different from anything I'd ever written before, and it had a cover that was very different from any of my previous covers. And so when I announced it, no one thought it was a real book, and that was not a good launch. You don't want to start off trying to convince people it's a real product. And I also released a book on Election Day in 2016, and that was a distracting day.
Yeah,
I didn't even think about it. I set that date up 3 months prior, and I was just like, some day, and I don't want to do it during holiday season. Holiday season's a really hard time to launch a book. I'll do it, whatever, in November 6th or something like that.
Right.
So, just plan. I think the main thing I just said in plan, outlining is planning, and having, setting up promos beforehand is planning. Just have planning for success, planning for failure. Just set yourself up, get yourself organized, and have a plan.
Right. Very good. Very good. So tell people where they can find you, Joe.
I am Joseph R. Lallo, and I'm pretty much the only one. There's a saxophone player in Australia who's also Joseph Lallo, but I'm ahead of him in the search now. So
excellent.
If you search for Joseph R. Lallo, you will find me. I am also, my website is bookofdeacon.com. Another mistake, by the way. You choose an author thing based on your name, not on the series, but bookofdeacon.com is where you'll find me. And on social media, almost all social media, I'm Joseph. JRLALLO. That's Twitter and all that.
Yep.
And also, I am the co-host of Six Figure Authors with the number 6 is sixfigureauthors.com, and you can find Lindsay, Andrea, and I have a podcast all about marketing and being an author.
And it's awesome.
Yeah,
it's one of my favorites. Yeah.
Yes,
so
mine
good.
too. I listen every week and highly recommend that, as well as the previous one, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast.
Yep.
We had great guests on that as well.
I love that podcast. And I write romantic comedy, but I listened every week to the Science Fiction and Marketing podcast because you just had such great information.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You guys do a great job.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys, for being with us today.
We'll have all the links in the show notes at wishidknownforwriters.com, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Wish I'd Known Then podcast. We hope this episode inspired you, empowered you, and made you laugh a little bit too. If you loved it, tell your friends about it. And if you feel so inclined, leave us a review. We look forward to being with you again next week.